Hello, this is Brian Hall, and welcome to what I hope will become a series of interviews I host here on my YouTube channel. For our first installment, we talk with Garrett Gabriel, local Lexingtonian and activist in the movement for Lexington PD accountability. We'll talk about the firing of Jarvis Middleton and the collective bargaining agreement by which the Fraternal Order of Police negotiates with Lexington for funding of the police with the City Council, with a focus on ways to, quote-unquote, defund the police. We hope you enjoy the discussion. This is Brian with take two of this interview with Garrett Gabriel, also known as Gigi. Garrett, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for the podcast?
Yeah, so my name is Garrett Gabriel. I go by Gigi. I do prefer Gigi, pronouns she or they. So I will say just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Lexington for at least up until 13, and then moved away and came back. I graduated from Transy. I graduated in 14. But anyway, graduated in 2014, have been in the community at different times, on and off, but always here. But anyway, a little bit about myself specifically and within LPD accountability. So I was attending the protest last spring. I will say I was a little bit less involved last spring just because I had a death in the family, which was really unfortunate. But even in the time where I was not as involved, I was picking up shifts for a friend who was an active medic in protest. So always trying to do it. I've been plugged into some of the standing up for racial justice, some of the local groups that are associated with racial justice in Lexington and in Louisville, really throughout the state. For a period of time, although I'm more connected to them, I don't know if I'm as active as a member. I do love those people. I don't want to name drop because that's kind of weird, but
How long have you been active totally?
This has always been something that I care about, and even within my broader context, my stepfather was a police officer. So there's a way in which I was kind of raised to, I guess, I had seen a pro-police paradigm growing up. And I'm not necessarily saying that my stepdad was a bad person, although I will I will say ACAB, I will say all cops are bastards, but he's not an active cop anymore. But anyway, so there is kind of a way in which, my stepfather was associated with the police. I've seen that rhetoric. I've seen quite a bit of what comes out of police departments or out of policing bodies. And, I do believe that it took a lot of relearning. It took a lot of kind of assessment of myself to get to the point where I can even speak about it. There's a way in which, like I said, a lot of the rhetoric that I was given as a kid, I remember really liking the Dare movie. It's because I really liked the animation of the movie, but I watched it over and over and over and over again as a little kid. And that's just a weird idiosyncrasy that I've seen that nobody else has. And so, I do have a little bit of insight into policing specifically, but then also I do want to stand up and continue to stand up for racial justice and disparity. Racial disparity. So there's just kind of a lot wrapped up in all this. I'm very cognizant of how a white girl standing up for racial equality is very much kind of white savior, and that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in standing up for my own community, which is a queer community, but then also to advocate for and really be alongside racial communities as well, and that includes Black, Indigenous, people of color.
You were recently on a Zoom call with the Lexington Fayette-Army County Government City Council, and what did you hope to bring to the city's attention when you recently addressed them during that Zoom meeting?
So last week was really interesting. I was given the opportunity to speak at a city council meeting. So this city council meeting was not timing, it was related to the collective bargaining agreement, specifically the police collective bargaining agreement. There are a bunch of unions. All of them have collective bargaining agreements, and they're typically public. But within timing, it was related to the collective bargaining agreement because March 2nd was when the police department was supposed to have edits in. And I had read the document, or at least from my understanding, I'd read all the documents that were public. What the document that I read was 62 pages, legal jargon, but 62 pages, plus a couple appendices, about 12 pages of appendices. So within that particular reading, within that particular agreement, that particular collective bargaining agreement, there were quite a bit of really just errors, in my opinion. I mean, there's a lot of quote-unquote oversight that's being done by the police into the collective bargaining agreement. Like, I want to say that they have like 3 representatives set aside specifically to edit the collective bargaining agreement. They're given something like 2 weeks worth of paid leave to do that. And in just a quick read-through, not a quick read-through, I dive into it. I'm going to read for content. But in a read-through, I'm able to find at least 3 instances that I would call discrimination, which is really upsetting. I have found several instances where the rhetoric surrounding police officers is called into question. Like, we can get into that a little bit further later, but, there's a good read-through by a college-educated person who's just a civilian, just off the street. A good read-through from a queer person should not pop up so many automatic
Flags.
Errors, just straight up errors. Like, nobody's paying attention to what those people are doing. And it's very clear, only police officers are paying attention to what those people are doing because that's all that's really funded to pay attention to what the police officers are doing. Like I said, 2 weeks paid leave. I'm for defunding the police, but it's like, we can start there. Like, if you're going to fund 2 weeks of paid leave to edit the collective bargaining agreement and it's poorly edited, like, let a civilian do that. Make it open source and it will get edited over time and turn into this really beautiful designed thing. Don't force it to be what you designed because what you designed is perfect, because it's not. It's just not. So the speaking specifically to the council meeting, I brought up those discrimination cases or those discrimination instances. There is an argument to be made, in my opinion, that even the document itself is written to favor specific classes of officers. So once again, I read one document. It was about 62 pages with 12 pages of appendices. The representative for the police department said that there were as many as 6 documents. If that's the case, I'll read them. But they have to make them public first. But anyway, there were as quote unquote as many as 6. But in the one that I read, the term member is designed specifically to be lieutenants or captains. Lieutenants actually have their own protections within the document that make them non-layoffable, which is really interesting. Like, hidden in the document, there's a clause that says you can't lay off a lieutenant, even though LFUCG reserves all the rights to even abolish the police department. Like, that's like Article 2 or Article 3. So, like, LFUCG retains the legal rights to do some of that stuff, but hidden in the document in weird clauses that aren't labeled by... like, it's Article 9, it's called assignments, rather than Article 5, which would be stoppages and like work stoppages. But anyway, like, certain classes of officers are given priority. I would argue that part of that has to do with a inflation of the size of the police over time, at least since the early 90s. And a recognition within officers themselves, which would argue like corruption, but would recognition within officers themselves that like certain officers need to be protected, which just implies that like maybe they don't need as many as they think they do.
I agree. It's something I've considered, just because I remember hearing that this was people who have this was something I heard about 25 years ago that from the wife of a police officer where, oh, it's just so rough to get a job with the police department here. They make you work like third shift for like 10 years. And it's like, yeah, because we already have enough very good police officers on the force. We don't need that many more. We don't need a lot of young hotheads that have the third shift for about 10 years at a time. And, I mean, we need them through the night, but we don't need an excess of them at the expense of the community, in my opinion.
I agree to a certain extent, but I also, I mean, there is an argument to be made, like, there shouldn't be a hothead on the police department in the first place. Like, if there's a hothead in the police department, get rid of them. They're not doing their job appropriately. And if it takes 10 years to put that hothead through rigorous training or rigorous community-based whatever, like, don't waste your time. They're a hothead. They've shown themselves to be a hothead. Like, they are the same as the people they're policing. If not, you know, worse, because they are given a gun, because they're given a state sponsorship. And, you know, the officer that we're talking about, which the difficulty is that there are two things that happened all at once. There was the city council meeting, specifically in relation to the collective bargaining agreement. But the week prior, there was a hearing for Jervis Middleton. And so there's a police officer who just got terminated in the Lexington Police Department, who just got terminated for expressing opinions in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement last year, specifically to a black woman, a community leader in the movement itself. So if you want to get into like specific details, there's a suspect memorandum that I don't like. There's like a series of things that are all wrapped up in this hearing. And in my opinion, it's the definition of a hush hearing. Like what is his name? Chris Edwards was in the control room of that hearing for the Zoom meeting. The reason that I bring up his name is because the whole time he's like, our mics are weird. We just can't get the mics to work appropriately. All of this stuff, like, yes, you can't hear, but they're just weird technical issues. Like, who can fix that? Like, you can, Chris Edwards. You can fix that. And if you can't get it fixed appropriately, separate the mics so that they're not as hot. Separate the rooms so that they all can have there's just so much.
Which is the purpose of a Zoom meeting, is to have it all separately configured in the first place. Duh.
It was a hush meeting because it was hushed. That hearing, you could not hear. Which to me is just like not accountable at all. It's just another instance of the police and even LFUCG not being held accountable for what's going on. It's exactly why there needs to be accountability within the police. It's exactly why there needs to be more community-based people with an eye on this, because it's super important. And this officer gets fired for one hearing. It's a 12-hour hearing, and I watched it all. But this police officer gets fired for a 12-hour hearing, and he didn't shoot a black woman in Louisville. You know, there's just a way in which, like, the type of termination, what is defined as appropriate termination, is so different for certain officers, especially when he's faced racial issues within the department. He's complained about racial issues within the department itself. I think my understanding is that Chief Weathers was supposed to theoretically meet with him and chose not to. Like I said, there's a lot of detail, and we can get into as much or as little as you want. But with all of that's going on between the collective bargaining agreement and between Jervis Middleton specifically, like, the police in this city need to be held accountable, but the police across the state need to be held accountable. And there's no reason to not. There was legislation, I think it's like Senate Bill 211. There's legislation right now that's going up that's trying to limit the speech of protesters. You know, right now the police are trying to project themselves as victims. They're saying, oh my gosh, these Black Lives Matter protests are so hard. We're doing so much. And I'm just like, you're a police officer. Like, you're given state-funded like, you can't do that.
They're literally standing in front of the police station. They're not going very far on this assignment.
There's just a degree in which, like, the police, even within, because the problem is I'll just like ramble. I'll just like spread this beautiful thing that has no focus. Okay, so let me focus. Within the police department, within the collective bargaining agreement, Within Article 5 of the collective bargaining agreement, it says, Section 1, the lodge recognizes that it is unlawful to engage in strikes and work stoppages. That's fair. You're a very labor-oriented group. You have to be doing the labor in order to continue to do your job as best of your understanding. So, like, you don't want people to just not show up for work. But Section 5.2, and this is what's interesting, is mass or concerted resignations and mass or concerted call-ins of sick or other leave shall be deemed strikes or work stoppages. So within the understanding of the collective bargaining agreement, there are actually 2 police strikes that are happening right now, like 2 active police strikes. One of them is COVID-19 related. So, like, there's a sick leave that people are taking in mass across the country. Police officers are taking in mass because there's a pandemic. But that's just by the document. Like, the document doesn't account for things like sick leave. And even in, like, I don't want to lose track too much, but even within maternity, like, the amount of time that's taken for a maternity leave is only the legal limit. It's only the smallest amount. But so it doesn't account for things like sick leave. So there's one strike right there. It's a worker strike, and it's the police worker strike for COVID-19. The other worker strike is in solidarity, or at least in maybe not solidarity. People could actually dislike the Black Lives Matter movement and still resign for that reason. But there is definitely at least an argument to be made that some police are resigning because of the instances that are happening on the ground at a Black Lives Matter protest. And that could be on the ground based on, like, police response to Black Lives Matter. That could be on the ground related to free speech that is being addressed and free speech that is being expressed by people who are protesting. I've yelled at Black Lives Matter protests. You know, you're going to be... I'm willing to be loud. And so there's a way in which, like, one strike is related to COVID-19. The other strike is related to Black Lives Matter specifically. And the way that it's being pitched by the police department right now is as victims. 40 people in the hearing. Chief Weathers said, 40 people have resigned in 2019. Maybe it's as many as 70, but I think it was 40. I'm pretty sure it was 40. 40 people have resigned in 2020. I said 2019. 40 people have resigned in 2020.
So 40 people resigned. They must have resigned for a reason.
Yeah, so that reason is personal, but those resignations, it's a mass resignation. Those mass resignations are strikes. And so instead of pitching it as, we're the police, woe is us, this is such a difficult, hard time for us, we're having to police free speech. This is so hard. People are coming to our front doorstep with complaints. Instead of playing the victim, really the best thing to do is address within your department how you're going to address the work strike that's happening, how you're going to address the series of officers that have mass resigned. Because, again, within your document, within the collective bargaining agreement, that's a strike. That's a work stoppage. You know, like... Instead of saying, oh my gosh, Senate Bill 211 needs to limit the speech of protesters, it's like, no, Senate Bill 211 needs to be shot down. The speech of protesters does not need to be limited. The police trying to project themselves as people in power as victims needs to be put down. There's no reason that somebody who is given the power to police specifically should be projecting themselves as victims just for free speech being presented to them that's in contradiction to, or, you know, contrary to their opinions about how they see themselves as police. Something that I want to add just to further, since you spoke to wanting your listeners to kind of educate themselves, since you spoke to wanting your listeners to, you know, get the knowledge that's out there, plug in, I will speak to a couple things. First and foremost, the memorandum that was released in regards to the hearing, specifically written by Officer Barochik. My understanding is that, well, I know because I watched the hearing, but the final verdict, there were 2 guilties and 1 not guilty for Jervis Middleton. The not guilty had to do with Borochek's testimony and how it was called into question. So there are instances where even the people that are releasing information, so the public memorandum that's released in regards specifically to Jervis Middleton, but the information that's being released specifically regarding Jervis Middleton's circumstances, that information is being funneled through channels that have already been called into question by people in power. Like, that's like giving a microphone to the person who is the most racist and saying, oh, yeah, that thing didn't work in your favor, but you can speak all you want to. You know, there's a way in which, like, Borochek needs to be called into question. If he is called into question, then that whole memorandum needs to be called into question. Its relevance to the hearing needs to be called into question. Like, there's quite a bit just around, and I would even argue that some of the news channels that have chosen to cover the hearing have chosen to cover Borochek's release of information because it was released by the police department. Because this is the information that we were given, so this is the information we're going to spread. But, like, because there's no civilian on the ground to do the work of reviewing the information, a racist cop within that, and I don't even necessarily call him racist, but I will say he's pushing it, like a racist cop hidden within that organization with no civilian oversight is going to be built into being pro-cop, even if he's not pro-cop. And he got, at least in Borochek's case, he was working to get Jervis Middleton fired. Like, he's not pro-cop. He's not. If he was, he would be pro-cop in a way that was, you know, just as much in solidarity with Jervis Middleton. Because as far as I'm concerned, there was information that was exchanged between Sarah and Jervis, but that information doesn't limit the capacity of the police to do the policing. And so if it doesn't limit their job, why is it so bad as to limit the capacity to have that speech?
And what's the present state of the city council with these issues? Like, what's what is the point at which they're at right now with these cases?
City council, and I can't watch every day. I would love to, but I can't watch every day for city council. Like I said, I would love to. But the city council specifically, there's a lot going on. Right now, they're also discussing quite a bit of, like, gentrification. They're discussing a bit of, like, rezoning within a broader, like, there's just a lot going on, and it's really difficult to address all of it, especially within COVID. So, like, anytime somebody's addressing zoning and restructuring and a tax information regarding, like, housing or gentrification specifically, like, anytime that's discussed, the conversation shifts to schooling, or it shifts to this or that, and that's good, and those things need to be addressed also, but there's so much going on that I'm just afraid, to be quite honest, all of this is going to be another instance of a hush case. You know, this is all going to be hidden by other important details. But, you know, the argument is, oh, well, there are 3 cases of potential discrimination that this random person, Gigi, this random civilian Gigi's bringing up, but this collective bargaining agreement has worked for at least 5 years. And the edits between 2012 and 2016 were not super major. So maybe we should just keep it.
That's their argument?
That's not their argument directly, but, like, I could see somebody making that argument. And I could see somebody making it in a way that's quote unquote really innocent, but that, like, ultimately does negative things to our city. You know, my representative is James Brown. I think James Brown is trying to at least hustle. I don't necessarily, when I say hustle, I mean, like, he's going to a lot of the meetings. He's trying to build a conversation, not necessarily about collective bargaining agreements, more about gentrification. But there's definitely a way in which, like, he's at least showing up to a lot of things. I think it would be really easy for certain people to just not show up to racial justice should just not show up to policing.
People like me who I can't even remember who my city council member is, but I know she's new.
That's really funny. I imagine if you're on this side of town, you're probably you could be District 3. If you're District 3, it's Hannah LeGree. She actually did respond to me. But I've lived in Lexington for a long time, and my family is from Lexington. My stepdad was a cop. My mother was in healthcare. My grandfather did some stuff locally with housing. So yeah, there's just a lot. And ultimately what I want to see my city get better. I want to see my city foster growth. I want to see my city build into something more than just, a series of horse farms and a airport that people come into so they can go to the horse farm and bet on horses. Like, love horses. Horses are beautiful. But, that can't be all my city's known for. It just can't be. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be all Kentucky's known for. Bourbon shouldn't be it either. There should be quite a bit of cultural relevance that we hold in this country, and there is. And a lot of it's black culture. A lot of it is the horse jockeys, and that's black culture. But, a lot of it is a lot of it's queer black culture. A lot of it's are you familiar with the pagan babies and stuff?
Yes, very pagan babies.
But yeah, so there's so much that our city has to offer with Sweet Evening Breeze or, bell breezing. There's so much that our city has offered and continues to offer a broader country. And so, ultimately what I want to see is I want to see this city serving me and the community members. I don't want a city who heavily polices. I don't want a city that sees certain things as certain types of expression in certain individuals as being more important than others. I want to see a city that builds on itself.
I was just looking up, I was going to give a shout out to Doug High, who just recently had an NPR segment that he had on bell breezing talking about Lexington. And it was fascinating how many people came out to the auction for her house.
I will say, speaking to Sweet Evening Breeze specifically, and this is something that was brought up by another community member within LPD accountability that I actually wasn't as aware of. Within Lexington specifically, outside of New Orleans, I think we were, for a period of time, we were the number 2 to New Orleans place where you could buy specifically women slaves who were essentially sex workers, where you could buy I think the term was mulatto, but you could buy mulatto women who were beautiful and gorgeous, and that you could do whatever you do to those slaves. That type of, our city was quote unquote known for that. And I bring it up only because bell breezing was a, Sweet Evening Breeze was a queer woman who lived in town. Bell breezing was a madam. So I bring up it is important to talk about the history of bell breezing, but it needs to be within the context of the, once again, racial disparity that is felt in the city. The fact that our city was known for that type of slave is important to situate that context of the madam. The fact that we had a madam is really cool, but the fact that we had a madam because black women were finally taking control of their bodies again. We're finally aware of the power of a black body and taking back ownership after our city took it from them. That type of awareness and context is just as important as the fact that bell breezing existed. And so, I want to see that. I want to see people taking back their bodies. I want to see people taking back ownership of themselves. I'm trying to do that myself in transition. I want to see the good in other people, and I want other people to see the good in themselves, and that's what I want for my city. So, heavy policing, heavy unaccountable policing, which is just fascists and racists hiding in an organization where they can be fascist and racist, and they get a government sponsorship for it. Like, that type of thing is not something that I want my city and my state to be known for, you know?
And speaking of fascism, who is it who had that quote you told me about fascism that sounded very, very refreshing? Well, I mean, it just sounded very familiar.
It's really funny. I tried to pull it up, but I couldn't find the article that I was looking for earlier. It's funny that you bring it up. But so the quote that I like to make, and it's probably not even a direct quote, but the quote that I like to make is that fascism is colonialism brought home. You know, there's a way in which the state, or even the state broader, like the national state, our nation can't export its fascism. It can't export its military any longer. Like, it can't just go into a country and invade and be imperialist and take all the resources, because countries are aware of the way that you can do that as a country. They're aware, like, hey, no, we don't want you here. And there are still, you know, embassies and things like that. I'm not trying to take embassies and like diplomacy away, but in terms of like warfare, like that stuff is no longer exportable in the same type of way that it was in 2001 or 2005.
During the times of the India Trading Company for tea.
Or, yeah, even farther back. But so, you know, that type of colonialism is, when it's not allowed to express itself abroad, is funneled into policing or funneled into something domestic. And I'm not saying like changing the resources. I'm talking about like literal guns. I'm talking about riot gear. I'm talking about things that have government branding. You know, I'm talking about the ways that like the police get militarized. Whether it be about guns or whether it be about tasers, and a lot of the difficulty within the collective bargaining agreement is even within guns. Like, a lot of guns that are owned by police are owned by individuals. They're not owned by but they can be. I mean, they can still be. They're still insured by the department, whether they're owned by the police department or not. Yeah, and like if a officer were to lose a gun that he personally owned on the job, he will get a replacement for it. And that's outlined in the collective bargaining agreement. Like, so there's still an armistice that is funded and regulated within, and I think that's the right word, there's still an armistice that's funded and regulated within our city just to accommodate the insurance for the handguns that are owned within the city police. So, there's just a way in which like colonialism can't be done abroad. It can't be, at least not in the same way. And so when it can't be done abroad, that fascism is brought home. That colonialism is brought home, and that's what fascism is. It's saying, oh, we're going to police this individual. We're going to say this type of expression is not okay, and we're going to police it. We're going to say that this thing is not okay. You have to go into jail for doing it. You know, whether that be, you know, gender expression, which it absolutely was in the turn of the century, or whether that be homosexuality, which it absolutely was as late as the 90s in this state. 92 is when homosexuality was quote-unquote decriminalized. It's not even legal here. Like, all of that stuff is still de jure, like by jury, by law, is still de jure racist. It's still de jure discriminatory. And the collective bargaining agreement is no different than that. And so I'm ready to see a not fascist state. I'm ready to see a state that is not trying to out-arm other people, that a bunch of white people in the middle of nowhere, because they are trying to be pro-guns, are arming themselves super heavy. So the police have to reflect that and are then taking out that policing on black communities that don't have those guns, or, you know, taking it out on Lord fucking knows, you know. There's just a way in which, like, Breonna Taylor was not armed. She was an unarmed black woman. I think she was shot, I want to say 8, but I forget the number. 8 times. Yeah. She was shot 8 times. The only charge that was given was for Brett Hankison, and it was for reckless endangerment to the neighbors. You know, that type of policing, the people that get caught in the crosshairs, it's not a me armed versus you armed. It's not a military versus military. These are innocent people that are getting harmed, and they're innocent people that are primarily black people, queer people, black queer people, and, you know, Mexicans at the border. Or, you know, there's any sort of South American group of people that are seen as different. You know, those are the people that are getting harmed by our policing. And we see it as not important. We forget about it. Oh, they're not white people, so it's fine. No, it's not. And I get tired of people forgetting. I get tired of forgetting myself. I'm smarter than that. You're smarter than that. And that's no indictment. That's just how things go. Yell at a cop. You know, that's the state of everything. We inherited that from 4 years ago. And so yell at a cop. Once Senate Bill 211 passes, which I hope to God it doesn't, but once Senate Bill 211 passes and you can't yell at a cop because it's all of a sudden something that you can be like criminalized for, you're going to regret not yelling at that cop.
That is demanding lots of attention from us as we go ahead and begin the second part of our interview with Gigi on Lexington Police Department accountability. In this segment, we hope to discuss the discrimination. Oh, wait. All right. Let's edit this out. Let me start over. Fuck it. No, let's just keep continuing. All right. We want to talk about the discrimination within the department. Some cases of discrimination in the language of the collective bargaining agreement that defines the department. Some would argue. We're going to talk about the specifics of the Jarvis Middleton case, and we're also going to discuss on if the collective bargaining agreement is good for the city, and how this relates to Lodge Number 4, who has been crafting. What did you say that they crafted?
So, really quickly, the collective bargaining agreement very directly does speak to the police department. It is made by police officers in Lodge Number 4. They're the ones who write, like, this police union, this fraternal order of police are the ones writing this bargaining agreement. And the reason that this agreement is so important is not only does it talk about all the things that I've listed, it also, like, outlines healthcare. It also talks about how there's sick leave or leave of absence. It also talks about, like, very day-to-day employee experiences within the police department. That's why I mentioned maternity leave a little bit earlier. There's kind of a way in which, like, certain very important things are outlined in document that relate to any worker who's going to be there, who's going to be working on the force. So these are all things that are, like, really explicitly outlined. It outlines clothing, it outlines uniform, it outlines life insurance. And once again, that's why it was so weird that, like, member is defined as being specifically lieutenants and captains within the bargaining agreement that I read, the 62 pages. That's why it's so weird that member is defined as specifically certain members, but not every officer. You know, like, it sounds to me like the people that are aware of the enlargening of the force itself, like, the people are interested in keeping their benefits, but they're not as interested in keeping the benefits of the regular worker. So that's kind of contextualizes the collective bargaining agreement in general. Like I said, we can absolutely get into the discrimination stuff, and I would like to.
Well, what do you think it would be more important to address within the discrimination that you see in the collective bargaining agreement, how it's defined?
Yeah, so I guess before I talk about discrimination specifics, I do want to at least say that editing these specifics don't necessarily make a less discriminatory police force. Theoretically, it might lead itself into that over a period of time, theoretically, but there is at least an instance where like these things have sat in this agreement for at least 8 years in the case of the sexual orientation discrimination that I'm going to outline. Like, that sat in document for at least 8 years. This stuff is actually, I said de jure earlier, like by law. Like, this by law document is crafted in a way that has supported discriminatory practices in the case of the sexual orientation as much as entrapment, just over the period of time that it's existed. Like, this type of non-oversight, police enforcing the police, being lax on themselves, being lazy on themselves. And I don't even want to get into like stereotypes about like donuts and stuff, because like, what's the point? I'm going to be very specific about my indictments. These details are details that even if you just change the language, even if you fix the language and all of a sudden the language makes sense, they're still indicative of a broader problem. And it's not going to be solved just by changing the language. It's going to be solved by civilian oversight. It's going to be solved by people paying attention to them in broader ways than just, a stamp of approval every 4 years for this collective bargaining agreement. Like, it's going to take more. It's going to take more education on behalf of the police. Jervis Middleton is a really good example, because Jervis Middleton has a bachelor's degree. I think it's in biology or chemistry. I forget which one. And then he has a master's degree, I believe, in criminal justice. He's a very educated black man that got terminated from his employment because he was speaking to a community member that he's known and mentored the children of for years. These are people in the community that are engaging the community as officers. And he's fired, where, once again, Brett Hankinson, there was so much backlash to even him getting fired.
What other discrimination would you like to discuss right now? We've already discussed Jarvis Middleton and the discrimination that was shown against him by the department.
So when I say discrimination, I'm going to get into specifics, and I'm not even speaking to Jarvis Middleton specifically. So in Jarvis Middleton's case, it my opinion was discrimination, but it's more of a systematic, prevalent discrimination that speaks to the racism of certain officers. That aside, in document there are at least 3 different examples of discrimination that I see outlined. The first one is really interesting. It talks about like certain times of the year you can request off. It's talking about leaves. It's talking about, oh, you have your daughter's recital. You want to go see your daughter's recital. How can you do that? So there are certain times of the year that a police officer gets the opportunity to request off. The things that are not outlined, that are outlined as times you can't request off. The 3 instances that are explicitly outlined in document: 4th of July, New Year's Eve, and the Roots and Heritage Festival. So what's so interesting about that, and why I really do think it's like explicit discrimination,
Well, right off the top of my head, that sounds like instant discrimination right there. The Roots and Heritage Festival. Why are you that specific?
The largest African-American-led festival, African-American celebratory festival that we have in our city, that we've had for 30 years in our city, is outlined in the collective bargaining agreement explicitly. And I'll even tell you the article. Let's see. This is Article 14, Section 4, discussing health and safety. I'll direct quote it. No member shall be required to work in excess of 15 hours consecutively, provided, however, a member may waive this section. This section shall not apply for Roots and Heritage Festival, New Year's Eve events, 4th of July, and in exigent circumstances or other similar events as designated by the chief. So, to me, that's saying these events have some component of potential emergency response, or, since it's police and not the firefighter collective bargaining agreement, or since it's police and not the ambulance collective bargaining agreement, which I don't actually know as much about those. I haven't been reading into how those bargainings work. But because it's the police specifically, it's really implying criminality. It's saying these times are times where we see an increase of criminality.
Yeah, if you want to make the comparison, July 4th could be like a patriot hard-on, like January 6th was for a lot of people, and that's why. Oh, okay. So I'm just trying to equate, the July 4th holiday as as some people would go like super AWOL batshit on those holidays. So I guess that one. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make a comparison to some local to some things that happened recently in the news.
I mean, I'll go ahead and say that there is an element of patriotism just in speaking out. Like, there should be an element of patriotism to protest. But, I get what you're going. I mean, the insurrection was ridiculous. Yeah, people who are capitalizing on American identity it's like nationalism. It's essentially nationalism. And nationalism can be in celebration of all the people in our nation that are actually doing good work, whether it be protest work or otherwise, or it can be white nationalism. In the case of insurrection, it was white nationalism. And white nationalism has a space in 4th of July, which is weird. But anyway, regardless of white nationalism or just nationalism, the 4th of July is an instance where a bunch of different types of people can celebrate that. The New Year's Eve, a bunch of different types of people are going to celebrate that, regardless of being white nationalist, regardless of being black, regardless of being any sort of minority discrimination or minority status. Queer people are going to celebrate that. So many different types of people celebrate those two events. The Roots and Heritage Festival is almost exclusively and primarily a black and black-led festival. To me, that's saying this festival is criminal. And that's a case of discrimination. Like, an officer who's black should never have to read in his document that, hey, for the last 30 years, we've been policing your community explicitly in our document. And like I said, it says in document, and in exigent circumstances or other similar events as designated by the chief. Like, even if you remove Roots and Heritage as in document, it's still a discriminatory clause. Like, it's been historically discriminatory for as long as it's existed. Why is that? Why is that? Why are we cool with that? Even in editing it, it's still going to be a discriminatory document for that reason. So that's the first case of discrimination. That's racial discrimination. So the next one is in paid and unpaid leaves. And I think I got a little... Both of these have to do with times that are requested off. So I think in the last one, I equivocated a little bit with... but that was in a health and safety clause. So that theoretically has to do with the health and safety of a public. And that's why, quote unquote, they're doing it. But like, if that's your argument, once again, are ambulances held to that same standard? Are firefighters held to that same standard? And are people from the health department who have naloxone training, like, are those people just as much, if not more so, important to the health and safety of that community? Or I'm not trying to indict a black community with opioids, because that's often not the case. But the are the people that are trained to respond to emergency and have certain types of training, like, why is it the police? And can we do anything to maybe reduce the amount of policing that's explicit to a black community? So that's the first case. So this one is sexual orientation. And this one is really interesting because, in my opinion, it could potentially be involved. It could potentially be called entrapment. So in the case of paid and unpaid leaves, the police department will give you a paid 4-hour leave to donate blood. Anybody can do that.
I've had a job like that.
It theoretically builds community. I'm not trying to take people's paid leaves away from them. And once again, a lot of these edits are just edits. They're not going to change some systematic racism or systematic discrimination that has been prevalent in document for a long period of time. But I mentioned that paid leave to mention, okay, well, only as of 2015 has it been even legal for gay men to donate blood, men who have sex with men. And only within since April of last year did it go from 1 year of not having sex to 3 months of not having sex, in order to, that's only just because of the shortage of blood since COVID-19. But so that's a federal law.
Well, I haven't donated in about, since 2012, since they told me that my lifestyle was risky. And I went, excuse me?
Well, so policing lifestyle is something that the FDA loves to do, and will probably continue to do. And if you were to lie, like let's say you've been in a position where the FDA has decided that you have a risky lifestyle, and they say, oh, well, you're not allowed to donate blood anymore. Or, for 3 months. Now it's 3 months. If the FDA decides that that's the case, and
they'll take my blood now?
Only if you have sex with, I don't know why your stuff is risky, so I don't want to put anything on you.
It was just being bisexual within 10 days.
But so if you were to try to donate blood tomorrow, so you said within 10 days, if you were to try to donate blood tomorrow, and you filled out all the paperwork to donate blood, like with the explicit attempt to donate blood, with donating blood in mind, and it meant lying on that form. Well, so if you did that, it would be a Class D felony. As far as I'm aware, as of the 2012-2016 collective bargaining agreement, and that's why I did a little bit of research into collective bargaining agreements beyond this most recent one, but within the 2012-2016 collective bargaining agreement, when it was still illegal for men to donate blood, that was still a clause. So any gay man that is going to take their paid leave, I get to leave and eat a snack at a blood donation center? That sounds great, any gay man that's going to do that on the force is potentially going to be a Class D felon. And if they're found to be a Class D felon, could they lose their job? I mean, if you're a felon as a police officer, if you have that, I'm not saying that that's something that is I don't really know how heavily policed that information is or how somebody would go about figuring that information out. But regardless, it's still an instance where you're paying an employee to go to a federally regulated, federally certified, there we go. You're paying an employee to go to a federally certified blood donation center. And if they lie and you know them to lie, like I said, could they lose their job?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. You should ask that question because I remember it was a blood drive that I attended at my employer, which I will not name at this time. And during that, I confessed that I was bisexual because the paperwork I remember specifically asked if I had engaged in any homosexual activity. And I said yes. And then the guy pulled me aside and he was right before I was going to donate. And he was like, we've assessed that you have a risky lifestyle and we can't have you do this. Guess what? I was fired about 3 months later for other reasons. But, I was a little paranoid at the time thinking, well, did they not like that and wanted me gone? Who knows?
I mean, homosexuality has been policed over time for a long time. We mentioned a little bit earlier how, just in talking, how I think it's still on the books, and it was only decriminalized as of 1992. Like, it's been decriminalized in my lifetime. Hardly, but it's been decriminalized in my lifetime. So, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. So those are the first two instances of discrimination. And the reason that I bring those two up specifically, and those are the two that I brought up in council meeting, like I very explicitly outlined in the last minute of my council meeting.
Yeah, of which you had 3 minutes to do.
3 minutes at first, given 3 minutes, and then they gave me an extra. They voted to give me an extra minute because they realized I was about to bring up discrimination. But because I had a lot to say, I still have so much to say. But anyway, so the discrimination, those are the two that I brought up because those are two that are protected in document. So it's a case of in document how the document is contradicting itself. Nobody has read it fully with a critical eye enough to know that it's really just contradicting itself all over the place. And it does. That's why I argue that the amount of time that's being allotted by the city paid to those officers is not being taken care of appropriately. Like I said, defund the police, and you can start there. But anyway, the reason that I bring those up is that Article 4 is their non-discrimination, and it says neither LFUCG nor the lodge shall discriminate unlawfully against any member because he or she is or is not a member of the lodge, nor because of the lawful lodge activity or refraining therefrom, nor shall either party discriminate against any member on the basis of race, color, sex, creed, religion, marital status, ages, national origin, disability, political affiliation, or sexual orientation. So within document, race and sexual orientation are protected. And in my opinion, there are at least two instances of discrimination in document that the original article is not protecting against. Like the document's not aware of itself.
It's kind of sloppy.
Super sloppy. But so further to the point, one of the things that is not protected in document, and in my opinion is really like a footnote. There's a whole quote-unquote article. Articles can be like pages long. There's a quote-unquote article that's 28 words long, and it's on gender. It's literally a footnote, as it's the last quote-unquote article. And in my opinion, it discriminates again. So the 28 words of this gender, quote-unquote gender article, I think it's Article 40. So any and all reference in this agreement to the masculine gender shall be deemed to refer to either female and or masculine gender as the case may be. That's all the thing says. So basically they're saying, hey, we count women too. It's funny because they're like, maternity things are not particularly great. Like there's a variety of ways in which they don't accommodate women very well. But as a trans person, gender nonconforming at the very least, or trans woman, if you give me that any day, I believe I am discriminated against in document. I'm not a police officer, so it doesn't really matter to me all that much. I don't know if there are trans women police officers currently, and if there are, you might be discriminated against. Now, it, in my opinion, is actually it is reading it as a male to female or assigned male at birth trans person. Because, like I said, gender nonconforming, so like male to female implies like back in the binary. But gender nonconforming individual assigned male at birth. I am not gender. Let me clarify for the people watching or listening or whatever. Gender is typically the expression. Gender is getting up in the morning and saying, this is how I am, how I'm comfortable, where I am. This is how I go to work. This is how I can encourage myself to go to work. This is what's going to make me happy long term. This is where I see my life going. Gender, that's what gender is. Sex is how you're assigned at birth. Sex is the doctor opens you up, spanks you, and says, this is what you are. Ta-da! Let me get the wand out. I'm going to tap your head. And that's your sex. That's what the birth certificate says. So I am, in my opinion, and mine's the only one that matters at this point, I am neither the masculine gender, nor am I female. So there's a way in which, like, that particular article, any and all reference in this agreement to the masculine gender shall be deemed to refer to either female and or masculine gender as the case may be. It doesn't even give me any protection. It's literally only protecting the masculine gender and people born female. There is no sensitivity to that article. There is, talk about sloppy. It's like 23rd, well.
What year was that article added, Article 40?
I don't know when it was first added. I'm sure that it was still there I'm pretty sure it was still there in 2012 to 2016. And I imagine Title IX, because all of this is still subject to federal law, I'm sure that it was applied at the same time as Title IX protections were applied. But there is still a way in which, like, it's sloppy. It's so sloppy. If it means editing the whole document to say they instead of he or she, that's fine. But again, editing the document doesn't change the systemic racism, the systemic sexism, misogyny, the systemic, heteronormativity that runs through this whole document. Like, changing one thing is not going to fix it all. And that's what's so interesting and really is the call to arms. Like, it's going to take people. Let's do it. Let's say something before, like I said, Senate Bill 211 passes in Kentucky. Like, say something now.
When is that Senate bill passing or up for a vote? Do you know off the top of your head? We can look it up real quick.
We can look it up. The announcement that I saw about Senate Bill 211 was really released today, so I didn't have time to read the full thing.
From looking up a state bill, Senate Bill 211, it has to do with defining everything in the occurrence of a riot, a firework, or emergency services personnel or public assistance benefits events. It's funny how public assistance benefit, could that even include going out to Kroger Field and getting a COVID shot?
A lot of things, when there isn't an easy charge, a lot of things end up getting defined as inciting a riot. I'm not saying that can't happen, but I am saying that a lot of the times those are the charges that are being slated. And I know that within Lexington there are certain inciting a riot charges that were that need to be dropped because of the overuse and kind of sloppy use of that type of charge. And that's just people associated with LPD accountability,
Looks here by the Community and First Responder Protection Act, as it's called. For the corrections impact, it's going to have penalties. Local mandates are going to have penalties. Crime and punishment penalty enhancements. Crime and punishments are defined as unlawful camping on state property. Violent offender, which is vague. Assault during a riot. What defines a riot?
So what little I did read, because I'm not reading direct from the legislature. No, that's a lot. I will read it later, but I need to get this information out that I am made aware of. So I think some of the language is intentionally vague, and I can pull up some of the language because I was reading the language before. It was just not via the website, that particular website. So some of the language, especially in inciting violence in an officer. So, like, if I were to yell at an officer and say something, what would I say? I would say, "Your mama's so fat," or "Fuck the police, ACAB." Anything that is potentially inciting of violence in an officer is something that could be called inciting a riot, and I would be policed for it. At the end of the day, and this is just my opinion, but this is my opinion that I'll stand by, at the end of the day, certain protected classes of people should not be the police. Police as victim does not work. It just doesn't. I'm not saying that police can't be targeted, but free speech is not what's going to target a police officer. You know what I'm saying? What I will say is something in the Jervis Middleton case, and it's really a 12-hour hearing. It's it was a bitch to watch it all. It's fun, but it was a bitch. But in that case, Chief Weathers, the chief of Lexington, says something like 40 people have resigned from the office, and does this kind of rhetorical thing where it pitches the police as victims. Oh, woe is us. These things are so hard. These riots are so hard. They're not riots. These protests, these nonviolent protests, are so hard. And that's really a key too, is that like really fast, just the use of the word riot implies that there's a riot that exists. Like, these are nonviolent protests. These are free speech. But woe is us. Woe is the police department. We've had like 40 plus people resign. I think he may have said 70, but I think it was 40. I've thought about this number because I was like, what was that number? But it's like well into the hearing when he's speaking, when Chief Weathers is speaking. But 40 plus people have resigned from the police department since COVID-19 began. According to the collective bargaining agreement, what I keep referencing, in Article 5, it talks about work stoppages, and it talks about strikes. You know, the specific article that brings up work stoppages and strikes is Article 5, and it says in Article 5, Section 2, mass or concerted resignations and mass or concerted call-ins of sick or other leave shall be deemed strikes or work stoppages hereunder. Like, the police are experiencing a strike. They're going to police my language. They're going to say, oh, you can't say ACAB. Oh, you can't say this. You can't say that. You can't tell me to fuck off. I will. I will tell you to fuck off. But they're going to police my language because they are refusing to acknowledge a police strike that is actively happening, whether it be because of COVID or whether it be because of the woe is us kind of, oh my gosh, this type of language is so hard to deal with. Trauma, psychologically traumatic. It's like, well, then use the mental health resources that are provided to you by the health department or by the police department. Like, those are the resources you should be using if it's really found to be as traumatic as it is. And if those aren't supplied, you don't police civilians. You figure out how to accommodate the people that are doing the work. You figure out how to accommodate a worker.
So one could argue that it addresses the hierarchy of pay.
It addresses the hierarchy of pay and gives certain classes of officers an out from something like a layoff. So these officers, layoffs, they don't want to talk about, and they won't talk about it in the table of contents, but they'll talk about it in document. They won't talk about it in the table of contents, and even hidden in a totally different section, 4 articles down, they'll bring up an instance that might be called a layoff legally, an instance where lack of funding leads to essentially people being cut from their jobs. They talk about the lack of funding, but call it a transfer. Say, hey, you can't, we're this far, we are the people that draft the document, because lieutenants and captains are the people that are drafting this member's document. Members are defined as lieutenants and captains. Lieutenants and captains are the people. And lieutenants are the ones that you can't lay off. At least as far as my reading goes. And so in my understanding, just reading through the document, in my understanding, it's almost as if they are being corrupt. It's almost as if they're building this document to exclude certain ideas like layoffs, to increase the weight of certain classes of officer, whether it be lieutenant or captain. I mean, those are the two ones that are even counted as member. And the only place where member and employee are equivocated are in the appendices and in health insurance. You know, theoretically, officers have, as employees, have health insurance. But the rest of those legal things that are outlined, member this, member that, like, theoretically, you could defund the police and you just read the document as it's written. Because all of a sudden you could cut things like uniform assignments or uniform requirements, or, you know, you could cut certain funding for specific police officers just by reading the document as only referring to captains and lieutenants. You could defund the police just by reading it and applying it literally. And that's what's so frustrating, is it's like nobody's read this and nobody continues to read it. And I'm not saying everybody has to read it, but I would love to encourage people to, or empower people to.
I mean, it's there for the world to see, and for you not to look at it and see how it defines the police force is something anybody can do, and then it brings up what is the definition of it anyway.
Well, so that's another really interesting thing that you say, is that, like, theoretically it is a public document. It was when I posted about it, because I did post about it when I knew that I was going on city council. I was like, here's the document, public. I'm going to make a pretty post with me as a beautiful woman, and I'm going to tell you how the collective bargaining agreement is. The moment that I made that post, I publicly posted the document on Legistrar or something, to a specific legislation website. I posted that link, and within an hour, the document was taken down. Now, I don't know if that's people not being accountable, or I don't think I have so much weight as to crash a website. Like, I just don't. But I do at least know that, like, all of a sudden I couldn't access it, and at least one other person told me they couldn't access it either, and it's in the public comments. So there's a way in which, like, even this information, when I try to disseminate it, is being suppressed in some way. Or at least, like, and I'm not super conspiracy theory-esque, but, like, there is a way in which it's the police, they're policing, and they are suppressing the voice of the people that are being honest.
I want to thank you for joining us today. You've really explained these two dynamics that are playing themselves out in the local police department that I was ignorant of, that I needed a little bit of education on, and I encourage our listeners to do the same.